Welcome to the second Focus podcast on mental health and psychosocial support in dynamic integration. This podcast is based on the second Living Well Together online forum that took place on the 21st of June 2021. Focus is a research project on integration funded by the European Commission. Focus aims to make an impact on both research and practice by understanding and improving the dynamics of integration in Jordan, Croatia, Germany and Sweden. Martha Bird is the project coordinator. She is working at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society's Reference Centre for Psychosocial Support, hosted by the Danish Red Cross.
We work along 3 dimensions. In our research dimension, our 4 university partners look at a dynamic integration qualitatively and quantitatively, and we work in 4 locations: Jordan, Croatia, Germany, and Sweden. And we work to understand the socio-psychological and the socio-economic dimensions of dynamic integration in all 4 sites. I'm happy first to introduce Dejan Ajdukovic, who is one of our key partners in the Focus project. He's full professor of social psychology with the University of Zagreb and the Department of Psychology there. And he leads the Focus research, so coordinates the 4 universities that are partners to the research stream of our project.
Dejan facilitates the discussion with our 2 panelists, Guglielmo Schinina, who is the head of mental health and psychosocial support and intercultural communication at the International Organization of Migration, and Alison Strang from Queen Margaret University, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Health and Development.
So, Guglielmo, you have priorly referred to a framework of vulnerability in the migration and integration discourse, and how it is not supportive of migrants, including refugees, their needs and rights, or their psychosocial well-being and mental health. Can you explain why that is?
Well, yes, I have been quite critical, in the last years of the framework or the understanding, or the public discourse that want all migrants to be vulnerable, and then make actually the vulnerability of migrants a political reason or a humanitarian reason for their integration. So what I mean is that usually we tend to be exclusive of migrants because we think they bring vulnerabilities to us, to our culture, our society, our systems. On the other side, we are accepting only those migrants who demonstrate exceptional vulnerability that comes from their past, from their travel, or from their present. These discourses, both discourses, a sovereignist one that say these people bring us vulnerability, so they make us vulnerable, they make our culture, our concept of nation state, whatever, vulnerable. And the one that say, no, we need to have them with us, we need to really integrate them because they are vulnerable, are in fact for me both discourses that don't help the integration of migrants. It's quite interesting to notice how actually migrants were considered in the industrial era healthier than the general population for the most part. And also from a mental health perspective, because usually they were associated with young people, usually young males, who went abroad because of upward social mobility objective. So this was the perception till the end of the industrial era. The problem started in Europe with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when basically our possibility to control movements became much less present, so much less possible. So our impossibility to control the movement made us believe that this would bring vulnerabilities. But in fact, it wasn't the vulnerability of the migrant, it was our vulnerability and our fear of the migrant. On the other side, from the 80s on, this discourse on the unhealthy migrant, the migrants that could be unhealthy and bring disease to us, was associated with the concept of trauma. So the unhealthy migrants became the traumatized migrant. Upon arrival, we create vulnerability of migrants, or the criminalization of migration. the fact that, legal pathways don't work, force migrants that are usually young people of work age, with all the possibilities to work, to end up in vulnerable situations. And we create spaces of vulnerability in order to prevent vulnerability, which is the big problem. Detention center, identification center, situation like Calais, like Libya, what are those? Those are spaces that are created for the assumed protection, or alleged protection of the migrants themselves and the communities, from deviant elements among migrants. Now, not to go too philosophical, but if you consider Foucault was saying that the first step of objectification is actually the one of creating threshold, spaces where people have to demonstrate something. And in the case of migrants, what they have to demonstrate is exactly their vulnerability. Because if you are then really vulnerable, you are a refugee, you can demonstrate an history of suffering, then you are allowed to stay. So this is my criticism to the issue, to the discourse on vulnerability. It's not true that all migrants are vulnerable or they have intrinsic vulnerability. It's absolutely not true that all migrants bring vulnerability to our system.
Thank you. So, in your point of view, is this vulnerability framework linked to the discourse on individual and societal trauma when we speak about refugee integration and the mental health?
Trauma, post-traumatic reaction means that you are suffering because of something that happened to you in the past, being it a war, being it the travel, being it poverty. Not something that I'm subjecting you to in the present. So it's politically useful to say, okay, you are suffering, and this suffering doesn't come from the rules that I put, from how difficult it was for you to arrive here, from all the obstacles that I put to your integration, but comes from something that happened in another system, before us, out of our existing system. On the other side, I think, that the trauma discourse was also part of the legalized discourse on migration. I was mentioning before, in the UK, in the 80s and 90s, if you spoke with the mental health practitioners at the time, they would say, okay, if PTSD is the diagnosis that I need on a humanitarian basis to keep the person in the country, or to keep my client that have another disorder, but that I want to keep on seeing because I think that's life-saving, then I will attribute PTSD. So I will write on the paper that the person has PTSD, which in turn created a situations in which the government saw that there were a lot of cases of PTSD, and therefore, a lot of investment was done towards trauma center, for instance, instead of centers that help the integration, as it should have been. I don't want to downplay here the exceptional suffering of people who have been tortured, who have been subject to extreme stressor during their life. What I'm trying to criticize is the assumption that the majority of people are traumatized, and that trauma becomes, again, another passport for integration. That shouldn't be the case.
Yes, but then where do you see MHPSS coming in?
So the role of MHPSS is, in fact, first and foremost, to demystify these discourses, giving agency to people, giving agency and voice to people. Even their suffering, but their suffering as they frame it, as they tell it. MHPSS is the process of giving voice to people so that they can identify what are their actual needs, but also what are their resources and their activated development. It is the one is true that people are suffering, because of disruptive events, but it's true also that people have resilience, and we study not enough. We never study enough, what are the resilience factors. And it's true that people, because of the hardship that they are going through, develop new skills, new resources, new strength. And when I say people, I'm not talking only about migrants now, but I'm talking about those communities as well, that because of migration develop new skills, new strengths, and new resiliences. So I think that the issue of trauma has to be expanded to understand that migrants become sometimes the scapegoat for what is a fractured and socially traumatized society that is in our country.
This is an interesting and paradoxical perspective, perhaps, and good for discussion.
But there are alternative models to the framework of vulnerability and trauma. Alison Strang is well known for her work on the UK Home Office 2019 Indicators of Integration framework. It includes a layer of social connections in the form of social bonds, social bridges, and social links. Her work has formed the theoretical basis of our approach to dynamic integration in the FOCUS project.
Alison, I'll turn to you now, as you have done extensive research and we proposed a framework that has been highly influential in the area of integration of migrants and refugees. Can you explain a bit how you view MHPSS in this regard? How is it connected to your framework?
Thank you so much, Diane. It's interesting, but my work over a number of years now has been very much informed both by the humanitarian context, where we're more used to talking about MHPSS, and the integration context, high-income countries who tend to view integration and migrant well-being, as Guli has been expanding, from the point of view, not surprisingly, of their own society's interests and their own perspectives. And I think it's been really helpful to hold those two different perspectives in tandem and potentially in tension, because for me, it does, and I think this resonates with what you were saying too, Guli, it does kind of highlight that contrast between what is essentially a charity model, which is embedded in that vulnerability framing, versus a rights and solidarity model. And I would actually argue that in the humanitarian sector, the argument's still going on, but those arguments perhaps started a little bit earlier than they did in the refugee integration context, so that there was a recognition that by framing our responses to the people who are forced to flee their homes as charity, as helping the vulnerable, what we were doing was forcing them into a particular role. And I think this is so true of receiving countries too. And perhaps you could argue that that charity model can be beneficial. It can prompt a response. It can open a crack in the door for some kind of welcome. But as I think follows from what Guli's saying too, it's not a sustainable approach, because that charitable sense is seen as an optional extra. It's seen as really building up the identity of the givers, and it disempowers the receivers. Are we interested in looking at these vulnerable people who are arriving in a settled country that is invulnerable and often that is assumed to have a homogenous society, in fact, a static homogenous society? And how can we plant these people into that existing society in a way that is not going to damage that society? That's the kind of narrative that policy has often approached this with. So we've tried to argue, well, actually, society is constantly evolving, and that you need to look at the well-being of the whole of society and see immigration as one aspect of diversity, one of many aspects of diversity. And out of that came the framework, which is known as the integration framework. Our UK Home Office has looked at all the research that's been done on integration since then, and through a consultation process with practitioners and policymakers, mostly in the UK, not exclusively, the framework's been elaborated, and we identified the core domains, which are the structures of society, the stable society that enables access to meaningful work and activity, housing, education, health and social care, leisure. And one of the keys that emerged from that work was that we need to be a little bit more subtle about how we understand social connections. So it's not just numbers, it's not, how many connections do you have, it's the quality of those connections. And through those connections, high levels of trust, there's the opportunity to provide mutual emotional support as well as practical support and so on. But that's not enough for an integrated society, is the argument that actually all of us need not only connections with people who are like us, but we need to be able to mix and match and move about society and have relationships with people who we would see as being a little bit different from ourselves. And that's what the bridge is. And then the final one, just quickly on links, is more about the vertical connections with society as a whole. Do you have a stake in society? Can you vote? Can you access public services and so on? In order to feel at home, to build a life, to integrate and build those relationships across different groups, we need to have the same rights. We need to know that we have as much right to be here as anyone else. So that was key. On the whole, most people will either recover or certainly their mental health will be protected if they're given the opportunity to get on with their lives. They can build a hope in the future. They can build a sense of identity and feel a sense of control over their lives. All the things we know about mental health. And this framework attempts to elaborate what you need to address in order to give people that opportunity to get on with their lives.
Yes, I would say that what you were saying also, Guglielmo, before is actually belief in the resilience of the people, regardless of being migrants or refugees. Of course, there are people who, for their history, are especially difficult situation, but this is remarkable resilience. I would also like to say that what you just, Alison, what you commented on the bonds and bridges, it's always good that people have or build social capital. And it's good for the both communities, when arriving and receiving. You haven't mentioned the threats that they may feel towards each other. Where does it fit in your model? Because we've seen that come up.
Shall I pick on the receiving community first? Because that's perhaps the area where we're most familiar with the threats. And interestingly, looking at some of the big policy frameworks that are currently in use across Europe, particularly the OECD, the MIPEX indicators, the one thing that's identified is discrimination, which comes from a sense of threat from the receiving community, that sense that these people who are different from us are coming and they're threatening our way of life, whether it's because of economic draining or cultural challenges or whatever. And what we've seen from that work, where we have embraced the perspective of local communities, is that those threats can be effectively dealt with if you take a holistic view of society. So again, following the model of saying, well, here's the vulnerable migrant. To be a good receiving society, we need to provide them with extra support, look after them well, and then all will be well. And the danger of that is then that the receiving society are then feeling that they're being discriminated against, they're not being treated so well as the migrant. So I think this way of looking at it, a holistic way of looking at it, is to say, actually, what we need to do is say, how do we address the needs of this community? And integration tends to happen in the locality mostly, supported by national policy and rights and so on. So we're not favouring one particular minority group over any other minority group, actually, but we're looking at how the different assets, taking an assets-based approach to community development, how can the different assets benefit the well-being of the whole? And if you don't do that, it's not only not positive, but it's negative, because it then builds up that hostility. Absolutely. In terms of hostility and particularly hostile environment, if I may, Deanne, the other example that's very much on my mind is that in the UK, certainly, and I think in other parts of the world too, there's been this sense that we need to disincentivize migrants. And therefore, we do that by creating a hostile environment. But actually, what we're doing is creating an inhumane environment. And we very much saw this over this past year when the COVID pandemic has restricted life, where people still in our asylum system were really taken to, in effect, detention in hotels, and they were provided with no extra funds. There were no processing of asylum claims. They were with a whole lot of strangers. They were not being kept safe from each other. So many different aspects of what is needed to protect well-being were undermined or taken away altogether. And we saw some really terrible incidents of mental health collapsing and violence breaking out. And all that, unfortunately, builds the negative narrative that we started with of vulnerability and being an unwelcome threat to our peace.
In part 2 of this podcast, Alison, Guglielmo and the Focus team discuss how to implement these insights in policymaking and give some examples from integration practice. For further information, check the Focus website and sign up to our newsletter.